All right, so today we're tackling some pretty heavy philosophical stuff. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. You sent over excerpts from Terry Pinker's translation,
Oh, good.
which is great because, well, Hegel can be a bit of a brain twister.
Yeah, a little bit.
So our goal today is to sort of unpack some of the key concepts and really get a feel for the journey that Hegel takes us on in the phenomenology. Think of kind of like a philosophical expedition.
I like that. And like with any good expedition, it helps to know the lay of the land. Hegel was writing this at a really fascinating moment in German philosophy, kind of grappling with the ideas of giants like Kant and Fichte.
Right.
But what's really interesting, I think, is his relationship with the Romantics.
The Romantics, yeah, right. Weren't they all about emotion and intuition? Yeah. I thought Hegel was all about systems and logic.
Yeah, you'd think they'd be at odds.
Right. It's
And in some ways, they were thinkers like Schelling were pushing for this more aesthetic, less structured approach to philosophy. But Hegel, while he was definitely influenced by them, he still wanted to ground freedom and knowledge in a rigorous system.
So he saw the value in their emphasis on things like art and imagination, but he also felt like you needed a strong backbone of reason and logic to hold it all together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that tension between the systematic and the aesthetic, the rational and the intuitive, it really plays out in the phenomenology. It's not just a dry, logical treatise. There's a real drama to it, a real sense of struggle and discovery.
Okay, so let's talk about this structure. You mentioned it's like a journey.
Mm.
Where does Hegel take us?
So he traces the evolution of human consciousness through a series of stages, and he starts with something called sense certainty. Imagine you're just looking at a tree. That immediate raw awareness that you have of it just through your senses, that's sense certainty.
So like I see it, therefore it is. Pretty straightforward, right?
On the surface, yes. But Hegel shows us that even this seemingly simple starting point is full of problems. If we really examine it, sense certainty breaks down. Well, think about it. What you see is that tree is constantly changing depending on the light, your perspective, your mood. If you try to pin down its essence just based on your senses, it kind of slips away.
So our senses, while they give us this initial contact with the world, they can't be the whole story when it comes to knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. And this realization, this breakdown of sense certainty, propels us to the next stage, perception. Here, we start to organize our sense data, recognizing the tree as having properties, leaves, bark a certain height.
So we're not just seeing a blur of green, we're starting to categorize and make sense of what we're seeing.
Yes. But even perception, Hegel argues, has its limits. We never fully grasp the tree in itself, only its appearances, its properties as they appear to us.
Because there's always more to know, more layers to uncover. It's like peeling an onion. Each layer reveals another.
I love that analogy. And this realization pushes us to the next stage, understanding, where we move beyond just cataloging properties and start searching for underlying laws and forces. It's the realm of science, of asking why rather than just what.
So we've gone from just seeing a tree to recognizing its parts to now trying to understand the principles that govern its growth and existence. This is where things get really interesting, because it seems like Hegel is saying that even our scientific understanding of the world is limited.
That's right. Understanding, while it's incredibly powerful, it can also become too abstract, too focused on dissecting and categorizing. It risks missing the dynamic interconnectedness of reality.
So he's not saying science is wrong, but that it's just one piece of the puzzle?
Right. To get the full picture, we need to move beyond understanding to the realm of self-consciousness. This is where we start to grasp ourselves, not just as observers of the world, but as active participants, as beings who exist in relation to others.
This is where the famous master-slave dialectic comes in, right? The struggle for recognition between two self-conscious beings.
Exactly. And it's not just some abstract philosophical concept. The master-slave dialectic has profound implications for how we understand power dynamics, identity, and even the very nature of freedom.
So it's not just about who's in charge. It's about how our sense of self is shaped by our interactions with others, by how we're seen and recognized.
Precisely. And that's a key point to remember as we kind of move forward on this Hegelian journey. It's not just about understanding the world out there. It's about understanding ourselves as part of that world, as beings who are constantly shaping and being shaped by it.
It's like we're moving from being spectators to actors in this drama of existence.
What a great way to put it. And the shift to self-consciousness is really a crucial turning point in the phenomenology. It sets the stage for the even more complex and challenging stages to come.
Speaking of challenging, we've got to talk about Hegel's famous dialectical method. It's like the engine that drives this whole journey of consciousness, right?
Absolutely. Think of it like a dance, a constant back and forth between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Okay.
An idea arises, encounters its opposite, and out of their clash emerges a new, more comprehensive understanding.
And this isn't about one side winning, but about a process of refinement and evolution. It's like a conversation where each participant contributes to a deeper understanding.
Exactly. And this conversation, this dialectical dance, it doesn't stop. Each synthesis becomes a new thesis, generating new antitheses, leading to this ever-evolving, ever-deepening understanding of ourselves and the world.
So for Hegel, knowledge is never static. It's always in motion, always being challenged and refined through this dialectical process.
And that's one of the most valuable takeaways from the phenomenology, even if you just scratch the surface. It reminds us that we should never stop questioning, never stop pushing ourselves to see things from different perspectives.
I think we've covered a lot of ground already, but we're really just getting started.
Yeah.
We've climbed from that basic awareness of sense certainty to the complexities of self-consciousness, and we've got the dialectic as our trusty compass.
But the journey doesn't end there. In the next part, we'll explore those later stages, reason, spirit, religion, and we'll try to grapple with what Hegel means by that elusive peak of absolute knowing.
Sounds like we're in for quite an adventure.
Oh, yeah. Welcome back to our deep dive into Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit.
You know, I was thinking about that journey of consciousness idea.
Yeah.
And it really struck me how each stage builds on the one before it. It's like we're climbing a mountain, and with every step, the view gets wider, more expansive.
That's a great way to think about it. And just like with mountain climbing, there are moments where the path seems unclear, where you stumble or feel lost.
Yeah.
But that's part of the challenge, part of the process.
Exactly. And the reward is that incredible vista from the top, that sense of really grasping something profound. So let's keep climbing. We left off at self-consciousness, which, as we discussed, is all about recognizing ourselves as beings in relation to others. It's not just about understanding the world out there, but about understanding our place in it, how we fit into the larger web of existence.
Exactly. And this realization that our sense of self is shaped by our interactions with others leads to a whole new set of challenges and complexity.
This is where that master-slave dialectic really comes into play, right?
Yeah.
That struggle for recognition, the desire to have our own self-consciousness affirmed by another. You mentioned it has implications for power dynamics. But how does that actually play out in our everyday lives?
Think about it this way. Almost every interaction we have, from a simple conversation to a complex negotiation, involves a certain level of recognition. We want to be seen, heard, understood by others, and that desire for recognition, it can manifest in all sorts of ways, both healthy and unhealthy.
So it's not just about who's literally the master and who's the slave.
Right.
It's about those subtle power dynamics that play out in any relationship where one person seeks validation or affirmation from another.
Exactly. It could be a boss, an employee, a parent and child, even friends competing for attention on social media. The master-slave dynamic is a powerful lens for understanding these complex interpersonal relationships and the motivations behind them.
It's like we're constantly negotiating our sense of self in relation to others, trying to find that balance between asserting our own individuality and seeking connection and belonging.
Yeah, and that tension, that push and pull between independence and interdependence, that's a theme that runs throughout the phenomenology. Hegel shows us that we can't truly understand ourselves in isolation. Our self-consciousness is always developing and evolving through our interactions with the world and with other people.
This is making me think about how much of our identity is shaped by the roles we play in different social contexts. I'm a different me at work than I am with my friends.
Right.
And a different me again with my family.
That's a great point. And Hegel would argue that those different selves, they're not separate or fragmented, but rather facets of a larger evolving self-consciousness.
It's like we're constantly trying on different masks, different personas, but ultimately it's all part of the same play.
I love that analogy. And it highlights how the journey of consciousness is never truly linear or straightforward.
Wow.
We're constantly circling back, revisiting earlier stages, integrating new experiences and insights into our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Speaking of circling back, I want to revisit that idea of the dialectic. You described it as a dance between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Yeah.
But can you give me a concrete example of how this plays out in the phenomenology?
Sure. Remember how we talked about sense certainty breaking down? Because our senses can be unreliable?
Right.
Well, that breakdown itself becomes the thesis for the next stage, perception. We realize that simply relying on our senses isn't enough, so we start to organize and categorize our sense data.
Okay, so the limitation of sense certainty creates the need for perception.
Exactly. But perception itself runs into problems when we realize that we're never truly grasping the thing in itself, only its appearances.
Right.
So perception becomes the thesis, and its limitations lead us to the antithesis, understanding where we seek deeper explanations underlying laws that govern the world.
I'm guessing that understanding, with its emphasis on analysis and categorization, also has its limits, leading to a new synthesis. It's like each stage is both a solution to the previous problem and the source of a new challenge.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of the dialectical method. It's not about finding definitive answers, but about continually refining and deepening our understanding through this process of challenge and response.
It reminds me of how scientific paradigms shift over time. A new theory emerges that seems to explain everything, but then new observations challenge that theory, leading to a new, more comprehensive understanding.
That's a perfect example, and Hegel would see that process as a manifestation of the dialectic at work in the realm of science.
Okay, so we've talked about self-consciousness and the dialectic. What's the next stage in this Hegelian mountain climb?
Hegel calls it reason, but don't let the simplicity of the term fool you. He's not just talking about logic or rationality in a narrow sense. It's about our capacity to grasp the interconnectedness of things, to see beyond isolated facts, and understand the larger patterns and structures that shape reality.
So it's about connecting the dots, seeing the forest for the trees, understanding how different parts fit into a larger whole.
Precisely. And Hegel sees this capacity for reason as a defining characteristic of human consciousness. It's what allows us to understand history, create systems of knowledge, build complex societies.
But I have a feeling there's a catch. Knowing Hegel, he probably wouldn't let us off that easy.
Haha, you're reading his mind. He's both a champion and a critic of reason. He recognizes its immense power, but also warns against its potential pitfalls.
So what are the pitfalls of reason? When does it go astray?
Well, one danger is that reason, when it becomes too confident in its own towers, can become detached from the real world, too abstract and theoretical.
So it's like that saying, those who can do, those who can't teach.
Well, that's a bit simplistic.
Right.
But it captures the idea that reason, when it loses touch with lived experience, can become sterile and unproductive.
This is making me think about those utopian movements that tried to create perfect societies based on pure reason, but ended up creating more chaos and suffering.
That's a perfect example of what Hegel is warning against. He argues that reason, to be truly effective, needs to be grounded in a deep understanding of history, culture, and human nature.
So it's not about rejecting reason, but about using it wisely, recognizing its limitations, and tempering it with compassion and humility.
Exactly. And this recognition of the limits of reason leads us to the next stage, which Hegel calls spirit. Now, this one can be a bit tricky to wrap our heads around.
I can imagine. The word spirit has so many different connotations. It can sound mystical, religious, even spooky.
That's true, but for Hegel, spirit isn't something supernatural or otherworldly. It's about the collective consciousness of a community, the shared values, beliefs, and practices that shape how we understand ourselves and the world.
So it's about culture, about how we're shaped by the traditions and institutions we inherit, but also how we contribute to those traditions and shape them for future generations.
Exactly. Hegel sees spirit as this dynamic force constantly evolving through the interactions of individuals within a community. It's like we're all part of this ongoing conversation, this dance of ideas and actions that shapes the very fabric of society.
It's like we're all threads in a tapestry. Each thread contributes to the overall pattern.
Yes.
But the pattern itself is constantly changing as new threads are added.
That's a beautiful image, and it captures the essence of Hegel's concept of spirit. It's not something static or fixed, but a living, breathing entity that evolves over time. And to understand history, to understand ourselves, we need to understand the unfolding of spirit through time.
This is reminding me of how much our values and beliefs are shaped by the historical moment we live in. What seems natural and obvious to us might have been unthinkable to people living just a few generations ago.
That's a key insight.
Yeah.
And Hegel would argue that our understanding of ourselves, our very sense of identity, is deeply intertwined with the historical and cultural context we inhabit.
It's like we're all swimming in this river of spirit carried along by its currents, but also contributing to its flow.
Exactly. And this brings us to the next stage, which might seem like a bit of a departure from the more philosophical and historical focus of the earlier stages, religion.
I can see why that might seem like a shift. Religion is often seen as a matter of faith and belief, whereas philosophy is all about reason and logic.
That's the common perception. But Hegel sees religion as playing a crucial role in the development of spirit. For him, religion is how community grapples with the deepest questions of existence, the meaning of life, the nature of good and evil, the relationship between the finite and the infinite.
So it's about those big existential questions that science and philosophy can't fully answer, those ultimate mysteries that we humans have been wrestling with since the dawn of time.
Exactly. And Hegel sees religion as offering a kind of pre-philosophical understanding of these mysteries expressed through myths, rituals, and symbols.
But I've also heard that Hegel was critical of religion.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't he see it as a limited form of understanding?
He did. He argued that religion, while valuable, can also become dogmatic and rigid, clinging to outdated beliefs and practices that no longer serve the needs of the community.
So it's like religion can become a kind of fossilized form of spirit, trapped in the past and unable to adapt to new challenges and insights.
That's a great way to put it. And this critique of religion's potential limitations leads us to the final stage of the journey, the peak of the Hegelian mountain, absolute knowing.
Okay, this is where things get really mysterious. What exactly does Hegel mean by absolute knowing? Is it even possible for us finite beings to achieve such a state?
It's definitely the most challenging and controversial concept in the Phenomenology. Some interpret it as a kind of mystical union with the divine, a complete and total grasp of reality. Others see it as a more modest but still profound achievement, a state of self-awareness in which we fully understand our place in the grand scheme of things.
So it's less about having all the answers and more about understanding the questions themselves, about recognizing the limits of our knowledge and embracing the mystery of existence.
That's a great way to think about it. Hegel himself is quite careful not to define absolute knowing too rigidly. He emphasizes that it's not some static endpoint, but rather an ongoing process, a constant striving to overcome the limitations of our finite understanding and grasp the infinite.
So it's more about the journey than the destination.
Exactly. And this journey isn't a solitary one. Hegel emphasizes that absolute knowing is achieved through the collective efforts of humanity, through the ongoing dialogue of philosophy, art, religion, all forms of human endeavor.
It's like we're all climbing this mountain together, each generation, building on the insights of those who came before, pushing ourselves further and higher towards that elusive summit.
That's a beautiful image. And even if we never fully reach the peak, the very act of striving, of pushing ourselves to understand more deeply is what matters.
Wow, this has been quite a climb so far.
Yeah.
We've explored the complexities of self-consciousness, the dance of the dialectic, the unfolding of spirit through history, and the role of religion in grappling with the ultimate mysteries of existence.
And we've reached the base camp of absolute knowing, the most challenging and rewarding leg of the journey.
But before we tackle that final ascent, I'd love to hear your take on what this all means for us, for the listener. Why should we care about Hegel's phenomenology of spirit in our everyday lives?
That's a great question. And I think there are many reasons why engaging with Hegel, even if it's challenging, can be incredibly rewarding. First, it encourages us to be more critical thinkers. Hegel's dialectical method reminds us that there's always another perspective, another layer to uncover, and that knowledge is a dynamic process, not a static set of facts.
So it's not about memorizing Hegel's system, but about adopting that critical questioning approach to how we view the world and ourselves.
Exactly. Second, Hegel's emphasis on the historical development of consciousness can help us understand how our own values and beliefs are shaped by the cultural and historical context we inhabit.
It's like he gives us a new lens for understanding the forces that have shaped who we are, the traditions and institutions that we often take for granted.
Precisely. And finally, Hegel's philosophy, even when it's dealing with these abstract concepts, is ultimately about the human condition. It's about our search for meaning, our struggle for freedom, our desire for connection and belonging.
So even though he's known for being a bit of a tough nut to crack, there's a real human heart beating at the center of Hegel's philosophy.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes the Phenomenology such an enduring and relevant work, even centuries after it was written.
I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but we're still not at the summit. What's next on our Hegelian adventure?
In the final part, we'll tackle that last challenging climb to absolute knowing. We'll explore what Hegel means by this elusive concept and how it might help us understand our place in the universe. We'll also consider how the Phenomenology continues to resonate with contemporary thought and how its insights can enrich our lives today.
Sounds like a journey not to be missed. I'm ready for the final push. Welcome back to our deep dive into Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. You know, it feels like we've been climbing Mount Everest, but instead of ice picks and oxygen tanks, we've got dialectics and philosophical insights.
A fitting analogy. And just like with Everest, this final ascent to absolute knowing, it's the most challenging but also potentially the most rewarding.
You mentioned last time that absolute knowing is one of the most controversial aspects of Hegel's philosophy. It's easy to get lost in all the abstract language. But is there a way to make this concept more concrete, more relatable to our everyday experience?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think the key is to remember that for Hegel, absolute knowing, it isn't some static endpoint like
Yeah.
reaching the summit and planting a flag.
Right.
It's more about the journey itself, the
Yeah.
ongoing process of expanding our consciousness, deepening our understanding of ourselves and the world.
So it's less about having all the answers and more about cultivating a certain mindset, a way of approaching knowledge and experience that's always open to new insights and perspectives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the limits of our finite understanding, embracing the mystery of existence, and continuing to ask those big fundamental questions, even when we know there might not be definitive answers.
This makes me think about the ongoing debates we see in science, where every new discovery seems to open up more questions than it answers.
Hmm.
The universe is an infinite onion, and every layer we peel back reveals another layer beneath.
I love that analogy. And I think Hegel would agree that absolute knowing is less about achieving some God's eye view of the universe and more about recognizing the interconnectedness of everything, the way each part reflects and influences the whole.
This makes me wonder if absolute knowing is an ongoing process, something we're always striving for. Does anyone ever actually achieve it? Or is it more like an ideal, a horizon that we're always approaching but never quite reach?
That's a question that's been debated by Hegel scholars for centuries, and there's no easy answer. Some argue that Hegel himself believed that absolute knowing was attainable, at least in principle, while others see it as more of a regulative ideal, something that guides our thinking but is never fully realized in this life.
So it's like that saying, it's not the destination, it's the journey.
Exactly. And I think that's a really helpful way to approach absolute knowing. It's not about reaching some final static truth, but about embracing the process of questioning, learning, and growing. It's about cultivating a kind of intellectual humility, recognizing that we never have the whole picture, but always striving to expand our understanding.
This is resonating with me because it seems like we live in a world where people are increasingly clinging to these rigid ideologies and easy answers.
Yeah.
It's refreshing to encounter a philosophy that emphasizes the importance of ongoing inquiry, of embracing complexity and nuance.
I agree. And I think that's one of the most valuable aspects of Hegel's philosophy. It reminds us that knowledge isn't something we possess, but something we participate in, something that's constantly evolving through dialogue, debate, and critical reflection.
You mentioned earlier that some people interpret absolute knowing as a kind of mystical union with the divine. Is there room for spirituality or religious experience within Hegel's framework?
That's a really interesting question. And I think the answer is both yes and no. Hegel was deeply critical of traditional religious dogma, which he saw as often being rigid, authoritarian, and out of touch with the evolving needs of human consciousness. However, he also recognized the important role that religion plays in human culture and history. He saw it as a necessary stage in the development of spirit, a way for humanity to grapple with those big existential questions before philosophy could provide more nuanced and sophisticated answers.
So it's like religion is a kind of stepping stone towards absolute knowing, a way for us to start engaging with those ultimate mysteries before we develop the philosophical tools to grapple with them in a more rigorous way.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's why Hegel, even though he was critical of organized religion, still saw value in religious experience. He believed that the human longing for transcendence, for connection to something larger than ourselves, is a fundamental aspect of our being.
This is making me think about how many people find meaning and purpose through spiritual practices like meditation or prayer, even if they don't subscribe to any particular religious dogma. It's like there's this deep human need to connect with something beyond the everyday, to find a sense of awe and wonder in the face of the vastness of the universe.
That's beautifully said. And I think Hegel would agree that those kinds of experiences, even if they're not framed in traditional religious terms, can be incredibly valuable and enriching. They can help us expand our consciousness, cultivate a sense of humility and interconnectedness, and ultimately bring us closer to that elusive ideal of absolute knowing.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've climbed from that basic awareness of sense certainty all the way to the complexities of absolute knowing, exploring along the way concepts like the master-slave dialectic, the unfolding of spirit through history, and the role of religion in the development of human consciousness. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And while we've only scratched the surface of Hegel's dense and challenging philosophy, I hope this deep dive has given you a taste of the richness and depth of his thought.
I know I've learned a lot. And I'm especially struck by Hegel's emphasis on the importance of ongoing inquiry, of never settling for easy answers, and always striving to deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world. It's a message that feels incredibly relevant in our current age of information overload and ideological polarization.
I couldn't agree more. Hegel reminds us that knowledge is not a static possession, but a dynamic process, a journey we undertake together, constantly challenging our assumptions, refining our perspectives, and expanding our horizons.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing we hope they'll take away from this deep dive into Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit?
If there's one thing I hope listeners will take away, it's the importance of embracing the journey. Don't be afraid to grapple with complex ideas, to challenge your own assumptions, and to continually seek out new perspectives. The path to absolute knowing may be winding and challenging, but the rewards are immeasurable.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought from Hegel himself. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. In other words, true wisdom emerges only after we've wrestled with the complexities of experience, after we've journeyed through the darkness and uncertainty. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep striving for that deeper understanding. The journey continues.